Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar tonight. I'm Amanda Mackenzie and this webinar is called Election 2025 Mission Critical. And I'm really pleased that you're joining us this evening, and I'll begin by acknowledging the land on which I am meeting you on, and the traditional custodians. And so for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I invite you to share in the chat which part of the country you are joining us from today. I also wanted to acknowledge that as we are meeting, our friends in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland are facing a nervous wait for Cyclone Alfred to cross the coast. And like so many other extreme weather events, it is more intense and more destructive due to climate change. So it obviously brings home the importance of having leaders who prioritise responding to climate change. But it also shows us that obviously the climate crisis is now all around us. And it's very scary to watch these events unfold, particularly if you're in the middle of it. So I know that tonight many will be worried about family, friends, and colleagues, and may actually be joining us from the region as well. So I think being in a room like this, or a virtual room where you're with like-minded people, is very galvanizing for me. So I hope you get a lot out of this webinar too. So encourage you to engage with the question boxes, the webinar chat. We will have a team of experts to be responding while the webinar is going on, and just really encourage you to be respectful of each other as we do that. So to just give you a little bit of context about today's webinar, we're talking about the all-important federal election, so why it is mission critical for climate, and what you can do to make climate a deciding factor at the ballot box. So we don't know yet when the federal election will be, but it has to be held before May 17. But it could be called any day now. And the science tells us that we have to slash climate pollution this decade to avoid the worst impact of fossil fuels fueled fires, cyclones, floods, and storms. So the next federal parliament takes us most of the way to 2030, what we have described as the critical time to slash climate pollution. And it means that the policies Australians back at the next election will shape the future of our kids, their kids, and many generations to come. So we always say, I think, that elections are really important, but this one is a really important one. And there will be a stark choice between policies that unleash climate bombs, billions more tonnes of climate pollution. We just saw the analysis of by the Climate Change Authority of the Federal Coalition's nuclear policy, saying it would release 2 billion tonnes more climate pollution. And we also have a range of other parties with climate policies that are accelerating the clean energy transition. So we want to get into that today to understand the policies that are being brought before us as the Australian people. There's also, of course, a flood of disinformation that's being unleashed on voters. We live in a very a different time to a few years ago, and making sure that we can cut through with accurate, clear information to foster our democracy is really important. So we're here to help. And at the end of the webinar, I hope you'll go away feeling like you have a deeper understanding of why this next federal parliament term is so important for climate action, that you feel clearer on which politicians and political parties are acting or are not. And most importantly, you feel empowered in what you are going to do next to take action on climate change to keep our kids and communities safer. So we're a non-partisan organisation, so we're not here to tell you tonight who to vote for. We're here to share the facts with you so that you can be making up your mind as to who you may vote for, but also thinking through how you may contribute as we have our sort of democracy sausage time in Australia. So just to introduce the speakers, we're going to be joined by our Advocacy Director at the Climate Council, Alex Engelmalen, who's going to break down the major parties' policies and track records, revealing how different electoral outcomes could either accelerate or stall cuts to climate pollution. We also have our Strategic Communications Director, Kirsten, and she'll be sharing our strategy on how to elevate the climate issue as an issue in the lead up to the next election, and practical steps we can all take to secure action from the next parliament. Alex and Kirsten are going to be supported by our quantitative analyst, Ben McLeod, who will be responding to questions on Q&A. So we can cover a lot of ground while they speak. But before we jump into hearing from Alex and Kirsten, I wanted to welcome our esteemed climate counsellor, Professor David Caroli. You've probably heard from him in one way or another over the years. He's an internationally recognised expert on climate science and climate variability. He's been involved with the IPCC as well as prominent roles in the CSIRO and Melbourne University. So he's going to share some of the latest climate science with us. But David, if you can, you've turned your camera on, thank you. Before we get into what we had planned tonight, I thought it would be important just to touch on the cyclone that we are all watching with some horror approaching the Queensland and New South Wales coast. And if you can give us a brief explanation of how climate change is making Cyclone Alfred more intense and destructive.
Sure, and very happy to join this webinar. I have done research on tropical cyclones and climate change in the past, and this tropical cyclone Alfred is quite unusual. It's travelled much further south than many other tropical cyclones hitting the Queensland coast over the last 50 years. The impacts of warmer ocean waters caused by increases in climate pollution are critical to this Cyclone Alfred. It has increased the amount of moisture that becomes available. The hotter temperatures in the ocean have increased the intensity of this cyclone, increased the winds, increased the rainfall, and also increased what will be the future impacts of this cyclone after it makes landfall. Landfall is uncertain at present whether it will hit to the north of Brisbane or further south into the northeast of coastline of New South Wales. There are three major factors associated with cyclones and their impact, and they've all been made worse by human-caused climate pollution. First factor, as we talked about, was the increases in rainfall, then the increases in winds as the rainfall increases essentially act as the fuel. Increases in rainfall due to the higher temperatures in the atmosphere, higher moisture in the atmosphere, and we hit new record levels of moisture in the atmosphere because of the higher ocean temperatures. But the final thing is the increases in sea level due to melting of ice on land and the warming of the ocean waters. We've had 20 centimetres of sea level rise over the last 100 years. All those three factors mean that the impact of this tropical cyclone will be much greater than the last tropical cyclone in this region because of the greater population and the increases in buildings and infrastructure all across the southeast Queensland and northeast of New South Wales. So climate change has made the impacts much worse. Back to you, Amanda.
Thanks, David. And I think that's a really important set of things to take away. And I think that as I've been talking to you over the last few days, the things that really struck me was the ocean temperatures are really hot, driving the ferocity. There's the rainfall, which is more significant as a consequence of climate, and then the storm surge riding on higher seas. So we've developed a statement on climate change and the cyclone, which has been released today, which is referenced into the science and previous work we've done on cyclones. So that will be put in the chat right now. Jay, if I could ask you to put in the statement in particular into the chat, I'd love people to take that away, share it as broadly as you can, because that's a sort of definitive statement from us on the latest science on cyclones. It's important that people understand that this has been exacerbated by climate change, and that this is important information for communities that are affected, as well as emergency services, to prepare not just for obviously this cyclone, but cyclones into the future. So thank you, David, for that answer. And I'll pass now to you to give us a brief presentation on what the latest science is telling us.
Happy to do that, Amanda. And look, can we move to the next slide? Because that first one is really just what I'm going to be talking about. This slide here shows the year-to-year variations in global average temperatures, and you can see the fluctuations from year to year, as well as the marked increase. We have now set in 2024 record high temperatures and set for the first time annual temperatures in 2024 that exceeded 1.5 degrees which is the target for the Paris Agreement. 1 year doesn't break the Paris Agreement, but we do know that this is the first time. And in fact, there's been an acceleration, if you look at this graphic, an acceleration in the warming in the last decade relative to all other decades. Not only was there record high temperatures, there were also record high moisture content in the atmosphere, record high concentrations of carbon dioxide and other long-lived greenhouse gases, and unfortunately, emissions of climate pollution. Emissions of these greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels has also set a new record high in 2023 and in 2024. The next slide, please. There has been across Australia and across the world very major impact from these record high temperatures. There's been associated with the record high moisture content increases in severe rainfall that's led to increases in flooding, but there's also been increases in very dry condition, increases in evaporation. So as I said, we've had record high atmospheric water vapor levels, and these variations of heavy rainfall in regions to then increased drought in regions, switching between the very hot and wet and very hot and dry, is exactly what was seen in the Los Angeles fires in January 2025. This is often called the climate whiplash, and we've seen exactly the same sort of thing in Australia from the 2019-2020 Black Summer to the flooding in New South Wales and Queensland in 2021 and 2022, as well as last year. Next slide, please. We've seen many examples, even in 2024-2025 summer, increases in major impacts in this region. We have in fact set a new record high temperature for the 2024-25 summer, combined with record temperatures in spring, so that the spring-summer period has set a new record. We've had extremes of rainfall in Tasmania, and then extremes of drought in Tasmania as well in the summer period. We've also seen extreme rainfall levels in the Townsville region and a very stormy summer period. We've seen in the summer as well bushfires in Western Victoria and bushfires in Western Tasmania. Next slide, please. Climate pollution is the major cause of these record high temperatures, record high moisture. And what we've seen in 2024 is the concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane at new record highs. And it's those higher concentrations that are really driving the global record temperatures. But what's driving the increases in concentrations is the increases in the burning of fossil fuels. And they have also set new record highs in 2023 and 2024. All countries have signed on to the Paris Agreement until the new US president has decided to withdraw. But what we do know is that most countries have signed on, and there are targets for emission reductions in the Paris Agreement, but unfortunately, global emissions are still increasing, and that means temperatures will still rise unless we rapidly reduce climate pollution and the emissions, not only in Australia, but encourage reductions in emissions by setting an example in Australia. Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, David. There are a few questions coming through, particularly on the cyclone. And so I thought that it might actually be worth answering the question around why there's a question about a hotter world's a wetter world due to more evaporation. Is that right, or is it due to the fact that warmer air holds more water? That's from John Smith.
Okay, both of those reasons are correct. Yes, a hotter world is often a wetter world globally. And yes, rainfall has increased globally, and rainfall on average has increased in Australia over the last 30 years. But there are important reductions in rainfall associated with the changes in the circulation patterns, which mean that the southwest of Western Australia and much of southern Australia has seen declines in rainfall in the cool season, in the winter time and the surrounding seasons. So hotter world doesn't mean every geographical location will get wetter. It just means geographically, on average, like in Australia, there will be increases in rainfall. So hotter actually means more moisture and climate whiplash, rapid changes from heavy rainfall to extreme dry conditions.
Mm. Thanks, David. And the other question that is come up quite a bit, both in the questions that were submitted, and there's a few questions on this in the chat as well, was the one on the from the community in advance was from Theru. Australia's emissions may be small on a global scale, but we're one of the highest per capita emitters and a large fossil fuel exporter. How do we counter the argument that our actions don't matter? Why is Australia important?
Yeah, look, Australia is important for many reasons, partly because we have the highest per capita emissions. We need to demonstrate that Australia can and is already reducing its emissions. But it's critically important that both the current government and the opposition have a policy to increase extraction of fossil fuels, coal and fossil gas, from expanding the extraction of those fossil fuels and selling them overseas. And our contributor as a fossil fuel exporter is as the second or third highest fossil fuel exporter in the world. And therefore, our sale of fossil fuels is then just powering increases in global warming and then the impact on Australia due to the export of fossil fuel and those emissions in other countries who burn our exported fossil fuels don't get counted in Australia's emissions. So the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition says they don't need to be reduced. They only count for someone else's emissions.
Hmm. And I think the thing that we talk a lot about, don't we, David, with the councillors, is that we are making progress in some areas like electricity emissions, where we now have 40% renewables. But overall, our emissions are still too high. So even though we are making progress, 40% renewables is huge progress from where we have been. It's not sufficient. So there's a question that came through just now from Shirley Lewis about our momentum tracker, saying we're on track to reach our emissions target, but David Caroli's heat maps seem to say that we're not. Can you clarify that, David?
So I missed that part. The heat map tracker has a series of emission scenarios. It has essentially current action globally. It has a very high emission scenario globally and rapid emission reductions globally. They're not just Australia's emissions, they are the global emission scenarios that are being used. And certainly stronger action in Australia is important, but particularly important if it involves stopping extraction of fossil fuels and exporting them overseas.
Mm. Thanks, David. And there is a lot of questions still coming through on the cyclone, and particularly coming south and affecting the Gold Coast and areas that don't usually experience tropical cyclones. Can you speak a little bit to the climate story there?
Sure. Look, very happy to do that. Tropical cyclones in this region of southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales are rare. A tropical cyclone hasn't impacted these areas for more than 50 years. And most of the reason why they're rare is that the circulation patterns, the winds from the east in the tropics associated with the wet season, and further south, the winds from the west normally take tropical cyclones away from the coastline, before they reach as far south. This is an unusual situation. It does not have a clear climate change signal. The only possible climate change signal is the warmer ocean waters over the coastline, but it's really the driving pattern or feature for these southward shifts is the steering level wind, which is the wind at about a height of 5 kilometers above the surface, and the weather patterns that coincidentally drive the direction of the cyclone. And note that here in this cyclone Alfred, it was initially tracking south, and then it sort of swirled around and is now tracking from east to west to hit the Queensland coast somewhere around Brisbane or the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast, and it is still uncertain exactly where it will hit.
Thanks, David. Well, tonight, David has been joining us due to his dedication on the night of his wife's birthday. So we're actually going to let David go a little bit early tonight. And Susan, if you're watching, thank you for lending us David and happy birthday. So we will, but if there are other questions that are coming up around science and impacts, I can hopefully answer those questions too. So we're going to wave goodbye to David now. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Kirsten and Alex to turn their cameras on. All right, so Kirsten and Alex are going to now dive into a presentation that they've prepared looking at political pledges and how they stack up against what the science says, and talking a little bit about our strategy. So hopefully this will answer a bunch of the questions that have been coming through in the chat and in the Q&A boxes as well. And if you're putting questions in the chat, you may want to consider putting them in the Q&A, because Ben McLeod, who's online, and myself can be trying to answer them in the interim as well. So go for it, Kirsten and Alex.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here tonight. So I'm going to be talking you through what's at stake. And I don't need to remind this audience, but there's a lot at stake this coming election. Our next term of Parliament will determine whether our switch to clean energy accelerates or stagnates, so we can slash climate pollution fast enough to keep Australians safe and Australians prosperous. While the last election really focused on whether we should act on climate change or not, this time round, the climate debate is firmly on the how. So the speed and scale of change that needs to happen, the technologies and types of energy that we will use, and who will benefit and lose from that transition. Ultimately, all our work at the Climate Council is focused on is doing whatever we can to ensure we get the most climate progressive parliament possible, where there's a clear majority of members in both houses of parliament that are committed to driving further action to slash climate pollution during the next term. As an independent organisation, we don't have a preference for what specific collection of parties and independents get elected. Our focus is really just on securing a parliament that's collectively forward-leaning on cutting climate pollution further and faster. But to understand who is most likely to form this progressive parliament, I'll talk you through briefly some analysis we're currently undertaking but haven't yet released publicly. So it's a bit of an inside preview, where we've looked at the commitment our differing major parties and candidates have shown on climate action in this parliamentary term, and what this combined with their current announced policies tell us about what level of climate action we could expect in the next term of government, depending on who gets into power. I'll then talk briefly about where things are at in terms of polling and predicted election outcomes with my crystal ball, and I'll finally wrap up with a brief overview of where the Climate Council's plans are for this election. So, the 2022 federal election delivered a clear climate mandate, but did the 47th Parliament deliver it? Was the question that we've looked at in our analysis. And we've assessed this parliamentary term on the backdrop of what came before. And our overall assessment is that there truly has been a significant amount of meaningful progress in this term of government. So some of the key reforms or the significant climate battles of this parliamentary term, I've laid out on this very colourful and poorly laid out slide. Apologies for my slide deck. But these are some of the big climate reforms that have passed in this term of parliament, which are really significant. So the Albanese Labor government has legislated emission reduction targets. They've restored independent climate advice to government decision making, which had been removed by previous Liberal national governments. They've introduced policies to cut climate pollution from major industries. You can see the safeguard mechanism there. And renewable energy investment has accelerated exponentially in this term of government. So we've seen $20 billion invested under rewiring the nation. We've seen the capacity investment scheme implemented and actually also legislated, in fact, where we've seen 32 gigawatts of new renewable generation and storage put into law. There's been a huge $1.3 billion investment in household energy upgrades. We've seen huge investment in 400 new community batteries, record funding to the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the CEFC. We've seen reduced transport pollution and provision of cleaner and cheaper to run new cars for Australians via the new vehicle efficiency standards, which I'm sure many of you out there in our community were actively supporting our campaign on in recent times. And we've seen electric vehicles become more accessible also through that legislation. So there's been some significant reforms, and throughout in all of those reforms, we've seen independent MPs and senators playing a crucial role in championing and strengthening a number of these reforms, demonstrating that ambitious policies are both necessary and achievable. So our science-aligned binding targets in the Climate Change 2022 bill, it was significantly strengthened by advocacy from a very active pro-climate crossbench. Sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties. I'm not on this slide, but I can't go back, so I'll just talk you through it. But essentially, in terms of looking at the federal election 2025, what's the likely outcome from that? All analysis points to a hung parliament and a minority government at the moment. So that's what we're fully expecting. Labor currently only has a two-seat majority, which they're very likely to lose. The most recent polling and most reliable what's called MRP polling, which is quite sophisticated polling, tells us that it's anyone's game, and the chances of a Liberal or a Labor minority government are currently pretty much even Stevens. Although personally, I think the statistical and historical odds still make this an extremely hard battle for the Liberal National Coalition to win. What we do know is that the independents will be critical, and a strong pro-climate crossbench could potentially deliver significant climate reform in the next term of parliament. And now to this slide, just to touch briefly on what our plan is at the Climate Council. So we've been actively doing direct advocacy with politicians. We speak to people from all sides of parliament. But we've had a great reception from climate champions that have been particularly receptive to our policy details that we've taken to them, our Seize the Decade and Seize the Sun reports, and our practical policy ideas that will deliver cuts to climate pollution urgently and as rapidly as we need to this decade. We've also have a very sophisticated media communication strategy where we're targeting people with good information in key regions and electorates, with the objectives to raise the salience of climate and highlight the urgency and impacts, the climate impacts and the urgency of climate. We're hoping that voters have this at the forefront of their mind when they go to vote this election. And obviously, the third and final pillar of our strategy is really to empower our community, and that's you guys. And so we prioritize supporting you to be the climate champions that you are in your homes, communities, and workplaces. So that's a wrap from me. I'll hand over to Kirsten now, who'll share a bit more about our strategy and how we're elevating climate change as an issue in the lead up to Election Day and how you can get involved.
So I will be talking you through some of the communication that the Climate Council has done and what that's telling us about where Australians are at on climate change and where we need to go. And then also looking at the story that the Climate Council will be telling in the lead up to the critical moment that is the federal election. So I'm going to spin through these slides pretty fast because I'm conscious that we don't have your time for that much longer and we want to get to a few of the questions. But this is an overview of where Australians are at on climate change more generally. We know that most people agree climate change is a serious problem, it's getting worse, something needs to be done, and that more people are connecting the dots between extreme weather and climate change, which is good. In terms of support for solutions, we know most Australians support climate action, which again is a good thing, and they do want a climate plan, but they're not totally sure what the government should be doing or what they've already done. And we also know that renewables are popular, especially rooftop solar. In terms of the general mood, we know that pessimism is pretty rife, and cost of living is the top concern for many voters in Australia. Trust in government is low and awareness of government climate action is poor. And we're seeing a lot of dis and misinformation cutting through, especially in the regions when it comes to renewable energy. So in terms of the Climate Council polling, this is just a little look at our annual tracking poll in terms of where a nationally representative audience is at on climate. And we found that the majority of Australians are concerned about climate change, slightly down from the previous year, but still a majority. And we also see that that concern is becoming more polarised. So there's less people in the middle, but more people are at the either end of the spectrum and also more concerned, more uncertain. In terms of the pace of climate action, we see that almost half of Australians believe our efforts to cut climate pollution are moving too slowly. So that's good, and that's a lot more people than believe it's moving too quickly. And then as for whether climate change is a voting issue, we know and we hear a lot about cost of living being the top issue, and that's certainly true. But it's also fair to say that climate change is still in at least the top 3 issues for many voters, and for some, it is still their number 1 concern. So we've seen this come up recently in ABC's Your Say community engagement, where they found that climate change is still a top 3 issue. In terms of our solutions research, this is based on some research that we fielded in late 2023, early 2024, where we were looking for how we can talk about further and faster climate action in ways that appeal to a broad cross-section of Australians. So not just folks like everyone in this webinar tonight who's really concerned about climate change and really keen for climate action, but how can we compel a broader group of Australians? And we found that the best way to do that is to talk about providing a safer future for our kids, and that that is a really appealing message across a broad cross-section of Australians, even for folks who don't have their own kids. Just this idea of creating a safer, better future for future generations is really resonant. And then in terms of our most recent research, we did a mix of focus groups and an online survey last year to look at renewable energy and nuclear energy, to dig into that, being that's one of the top sort of issues that's emerging in this federal election campaign. And we found that renewables are way more popular than nuclear, which is good news. So 65% of voters support moving to renewables, and 38.5% of voters support introducing nuclear power, so way more support for renewables. And we also asked voters to choose either renewables or nuclear across a bunch of different metrics, and we found that renewables won out across almost all of them, other than reliability. And when we dug into that a little bit more, we found that suburban voters do still favour renewables in terms of reliability, but regional voters favour nuclear. So definitely see that that reliability frame is sort of the biggest thorn in the side of building the case for renewables. When we dug into this in our focus groups, we heard a lot from voters about their concerns around renewables being either unreliable based on that intermittent, inconsistent nature, e.g. what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and also unready in terms of just skepticism that the infrastructure and the technology is there to be able to provide that power at scale that we need. We've seen that this is underpinned by a lack of awareness of Australia's progress to date in terms of how much of our power is already coming from renewables. So very few Australians know how far along we are in that transition. Most of them underestimate it. Many say they don't know. And when we put that statistic in front of people in our focus groups, most didn't know it. Many found it unbelievable, and some even sort of flat out rejected it as being fake news. So that was definitely sort of a reality check for us in terms of realizing that we need to keep repeating that message until it starts to sink in, particularly with audiences that are less focused on this issue, and also finding different ways of showing that progress that's been made and not just telling. By contrast, we heard a lot about how nuclear is perceived as reliable and powerful, and also this idea that it can be part of a balanced energy mix alongside renewables was really appealing to people. We also found that men were much more supportive of nuclear versus women who were much less supportive and much more persuadable by our messaging. And we've seen that come up in other polling as well. When we dug into that in our focus groups, we found that the women in our focus groups, and these were in outer suburban or regional electorates with voters who tend to be less climate concerned, it was more of a challenge of engagement, and women were more risk-oriented. And for men, they were much more engaged on these issues, but also much more distrustful and resistant to our counter-messaging. So in terms of how this research is informing the story that we'll be telling, we are really focused in the election campaign on raising the salience of climate change. So reminding voters that climate pollution is overheating our planet and causing unnatural disasters. And you might have seen the recent heat map that we put out last week on that issue. We are also really focused on talking about how renewable power is here now and can provide that reliable power 24/7, reiterating that 40% statistic that I mentioned, and we put a report out on that topic earlier this year that you might have seen. We also want to be talking about the benefits that renewables are providing Australians in terms of safety, clean power, cutting climate pollution, but also how climate solutions can be cost of living solutions and the jobs and economic opportunities that are coming from the shift. We want to be talking about how coal is on the way out. As I mentioned, that was the most compelling message, and we put out a report on the topic of our ageing coal-fired power stations and the way that they are ramping up blackout risk earlier this year that you can check out on our website. We are also talking about the risk of nuclear energy. As I mentioned, that was the top performing frame in our research in terms of the riskiness of nuclear, and we've done a lot of work around that in terms of putting in submissions to the Parliamentary Nuclear Inquiry. Amanda and Greg Bourne, our councillor, appeared at those hearings, and we've also done a lot of media work on that topic. And lastly, we want to be talking about how this election is really make or break for climate action. So as has already been mentioned tonight, we're halfway through the critical decade. Decisions made in this term of Parliament will set our climate trajectory for decades to come. As Alex mentioned, the Federal Coalition has no credible plan to cut climate pollution, and per our research, we need to be reminding voters that they should vote like our lives and our kids' future depends on it. So that is it. And also just wanted to say thank you to everyone here for all the work that you do to support our work, from sharing our content, having climate conversations with your friends and family, funding our work, and helping us compete for share of voice up against a well-funded opposition. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kirsten. And I think that's sort of a relevant question, is how do we compete for share of voice? I think there's a lot of questions here about how we make sure our message is getting out there, particularly in an election context, and how we're competing with groups like Advance, who are putting forward misleading information, actually just lies and things like that. Kirsten, how do you think we need to be operating in terms of the what's often called organic social content, the stuff that we just put out there and all of you share, versus when we need to pay for it? How important is having some capacity to do some paid advertising too?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, Amanda, and that's something that we are focused on. And we've actually been working on a few TV ads that we're hoping to get out on the airwaves in the lead up to the election. And hopefully we'll have time to give you a sneak peek of one of those tonight.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, maybe we do that now. We just segue into showing you one of our sneak peek videos. Don't tell anyone yet, but we've been working on some a series of really cut through videos that talk to some different issues that the community is concerned about. But as Kirsten and Alex mentioned, one of the key things this election is just elevating climate up the agenda. Of course, cost of living is the dominant issue in the electorate at the moment. We want to make sure people are thinking about climate change, thinking about the impact on our kids, our grandkids, and what all of this means. So we might do that right now, actually. Jay, who's behind the scenes, is going to share the ad. Kirsten's the maker of that ad, working with our team, and she's been doing a really good job. I think trying to craft a message that's said so succinctly is often really challenging. So I hope you really enjoy that, and will share it out amongst your family and friends too. But you can also help us amplify that ad and make sure it's getting in front of people prior to the election, as well as other things that we will be doing. As I mentioned right at the top, we are very focused on the cyclone right now. We think it's absolutely critical that Australians understand that this cyclone is being made worse by climate. I often compare it to a car accident. If there was speeding involved, we need to know it so we can make sure that we are preparing our community, and our community knows the reason that something happens. It's the only way we can change. So with this cyclone, it's important for our communities, our emergency responders, and particularly for our politicians to know that this has been exacerbated by the climate crisis, and we absolutely need to be slashing our emissions. So we'll be doing a lot, as I said, around the election, making sure that we're elevating climate on the agenda, and a whole series of other things. There's been a lot of questions in the chat about what we're doing, and that it does include the advocacy work that Alex has talked about, trying to get politicians to adopt our policies, as well as sharing the communications. Kirsten's presentation tonight showed you a whole range of ways that it's effective to talk about these issues, which is obviously in a contested space. So we're always sharing that information with climate champions across Australia to encourage them to communicate effectively with people that they're coming into contact with. So I would, if you want to keep supporting our work, it's a great time to do it, because we need a range of donations to help us get these messages out in front of people, elevating things like this ad. So $90 helps us reach 5,000 voters with these messages. So it's sort of as simple as that. How many times can we get in front of people in the next few weeks to few months? So before we wrap up, we've got a couple more minutes. I thought I'd just ask Kirsten and Alex to reflect on. I haven't told them I'm going to ask them this question, but just we're working really hard behind the scenes at the moment to elevate these issues. As I said, just what is making you feel hopeful and enthusiastic about this at the moment? Because I understand lots of people are feeling a bit like they like to put their head under the doona at this moment. But we're obviously telling ourselves we're going to make as much difference as possible. So, Alex, what do you think?
A couple of things from me. I'm excited that we're already, in terms of our cutting climate pollution from our electricity sector, we're already 40% of the way there. So, we already have 40% of renewables powering our main grid. And as I've just talked through, there has been a huge amount of progress happen in this term of government, which we should all be really excited about. And I don't think the government of today is particularly good at selling. But I have the privilege in my day-to-day job at the Climate Council and being able to be across and analyze all of that and see what progress has been made. So that gives me hope that we're not at the starting blocks. We're well on the way. And I also get to see and be inspired by my amazing colleagues that come up with great content and material like you've just seen. But also we've got some incredible stuff in the works on the cyclone. We've just released that heat map. Like it's really groundbreaking stuff, and it is changing the conversation in Australia on these issues. So that excites me every day to be a part of that.
Thank you. Kirsten?
Yeah, I could talk about a few things too. I've been back at the Climate Council for about 9 months, but I actually first worked at the Climate Council back in the early days, about a year after it was founded. And I worked with the team for a few years, and then I took a break away from the climate movement because I just needed that. But it's been really exciting to see how much progress has been made in that time, and it's really motivating to me to see how far we've come. And I think that's given me a whole new energy, even though, as Alex mentioned, we've still got a ways to go. I think it's really incredible that how much momentum we've made in the last 10 years. And then also, I know there was a bit of chat in the chat earlier on about the depressing state of politics in the US, but I've actually been really motivated by that as well, and seeing the resistance that's coming up against that, not just in politics, but in the community and different states and cities rising up to push back on that and keep advocating for climate action. So I've been finding that, really motivating, and very keen to keep fighting the good fight in Australia.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Alex and Kirsten. That's really great. I think I was reflecting yesterday about reading some things on Donald Trump and feeling depressed about it. And then I thought, well, what an ambitious agenda Donald Trump has. Like, maybe the one silver lining of Donald Trump could be that we channel our own inner Donald Trump in terms of the level of ambition that we take to making the world a better place, to tackling the climate crisis, to slashing climate pollution and climate justice. So I've got that in my mind at the moment. Like, I think sometimes we're just kind of standing back in shock and thinking, oh, well, how far can we actually go? Well, Trump proves that you can just change things sort of at a whim. So let's go and try and make as much difference as we can. So thanks, Kirsten and Alex. Thanks, David, who left us earlier. And thank you all for joining us in the webinar. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and you'll get an email from us in the next few days with a link to the recording, as well as resources referred to in the webinar. So there's a lot of posting of resources in the chat. We've tried to get to most questions and to follow the chat, but we haven't got to all of them. So, but you can always send questions into the Climate Council too. But really appreciate your support and love having these chats. And there'll certainly be more of them prior to the election as well. So we'll see you soon.
Authorised by A. Mackenzie, the Climate Council, Melbourne.